like to say anything about communalism combat? You said earlier that you started it more as a, not as a media platform, but also to kind of mobilize support for human rights issues, and now you have a strong presence online with Sabrang India. My question is that did you face any kind of restrictions when you were working with communal combat in the early days, and how it has changed with Sabrang India?
Yeah.
Sabrang.
Thank you so much. I wanted to find out when you spoke about institutional memory, how does institutional memory and degrading institutional memory, how does one engage with institutions that are responsible for recording the truth, that are responsible for engaging with the truth? These institutions themselves act in a very prejudiced, irresponsible manner. When Rahul Sharma submitted CDs and he was boycotted, trying to actively being avoided from submitting the CD records, or when questions as to why the bodies were taken from Godhra to Ahmedabad weren't clearly asked. When these kind of institutions are so prejudiced, which is supposed to record the truth, how does one engage with it? Or how do you engage with it?
Just as an add-on to that, also given that these institutions are supposed to be, or are the institutions in power which breathe life into the constitution, then how much can we still use the constitution as a crutch for this kind of sort of activism? For example, the BJP in its manifesto in UP now said that we will build the Ram temple within the law. So, given their arrogance about this, how much space is there within the constitution?
See, these are, sorry.
So you will address those first?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just see. Basically, these are very tough questions. There's no real, I can only share some insights. I mean, if you ask me, I believe we are facing the singularly greatest challenge, not just in terms of our courts, but as a nation today. I mean, this is not strictly part of my book yet, and whatever, maybe it will be another book if we all survive that, but I really believe that it's an actually singularly important threat that we are facing. And the reason for that is that the very constitution on which we build so much hope and build so much faith, I believe is what is under attack. And I say this with a sense of responsibility because I believe that the party that we are looking at in power is a party that openly says it wants to overthrow the constitution. And I'm not, and the BJP is just the parliamentary wing of it. I'm talking about the RSS. So, we are faced with that, and that is what the extent and the depth of the challenge we are faced with. Now, obviously, therefore, you can see it every day. I don't want to outline it. Our courts are also being made to puppeteer in a certain way. We are seeing it. It's not a very pleasant sight. And you're seeing the kind of very shameless efforts that are being made to try and even get the judiciary to bend. I'm sure you saw Nariman's piece a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure, you saw Unnikrishna's piece today. So the point is, whether it's a finance bill and the way that is, the money bills are being pushed through, whether it is an assault on the Forest Rights Act, whether it is the Enemy Property Act, whether it is the citizenship law which is being changed to actually be completely unconstitutional. I mean, a Muslim migrant is treated differently from a non-Muslim migrant. I mean, put it very crassly. I mean, again, I'll say one more example is that you had the first time the opposition that came together in this October 2014 after kind of numbness had hit them after Modi's victory. The first time they sort of got up is when the land ordinance came up. That was seen as a huge victory, that the fact that the land ordinance, but excuse me, after that, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, Jharkhand, 4 states have passed laws, Gujarat, which are worse than the land ordinance. And they've done it constitutionally because they've taken the permission of the president. And the same president that we are going to meet tomorrow gave his assent to those laws. So we are in a really critical situation, a situation by which I could say we are on the edge, we are on the precipice. Within that, we are negotiating which institutions you can use, which you cannot use, what you can use, at what stage you need to use people's power, at what point you need to. I mean, look at the Maruti workers' judgment. You have the Maruti workers' judgment, there's something going on here, you have the protests going on today in Delhi and Gurgaon, and you have a judge saying, with due respect, that though there is no evidence, it is to uphold the dignity of Make in India and connecting people to life. I mean, that is in effect what the judge is saying. There was no evidence against those workers. The accused could not be identified in court. The weapons, the arms that were used to kill that general manager who was a pro-worker manager, ironically enough. You know, so it's like it's happening at multiple levels. This assault is happening, and therefore I believe it's a time to think out of the box, think of building alliances, think creatively, and I think also not lose our complete sense of optimism and ability to do it. Because if we do, then we'll just stop acting. I said this in 2014 in May. He said, whatever else you do, want to become a good lawyer, want to become a career lawyer, do it. But spend 2-3 hours a day on just making sure India survives. In whatever way you see fit. You need to give that 2-3 hours a day extra. Don't just be professionals now. It's not enough.
I just want to add to that. I met a foreign faculty of this university who told me that she had been told by a dean here that she first asked me why were the Gujaratis, she saw the documentary as well, and she said, why were the Gujaratis so afraid of Muslims? So I tried to explain to her the kind of falsified medieval history that's propagated, and Muslims are portrayed as Pakistanis and all that. And then she said, but how can they do this? She said, wasn't Jawaharlal Nehru a Muslim? So I said,
She's got it from the internet and the RSS page.
No, she's got it from a dean in this university. So she said he was a Muslim. So I said, I laughed. I thought this was ridiculous. Then she said he wasn't his mother married to someone else earlier, and she had 3 sons, and then she got married to that lawyer, and I'm assuming she's referring to Motilal. And Jinnah was one of his brothers. I said,
No, but this is the kind of
I said,
that's been
it's
scary. It's scary.
What I'm trying to say is that I said, obviously she's a foreigner, she didn't know, and
Yeah.
but a dean in the university told her this, and then I said to her that there's an article in the Indian Express last week on WhatsApp forwards, and this guy is saying he worked on Rwanda, and he's saying take these WhatsApp forwards seriously. That WhatsApp forward which tells you that Nehru died of AIDS, you might laugh at it, but lots of people are believing it.
Yeah.
And this has a strange parallel to Rwanda, because there was a radio station in Rwanda which used to broadcast things like Tutsis made Hutus their slaves in the colonial period, and they are still not free from Tutsi slavery. And used to give entertainment programs around it. It used to have music, it used to have all kinds of things, and between this kind of messaging used to happen. This continued for about 4 years before the genocide broke out.
Yeah.
It's in the Indian Express last week. You can read it.
8 lakh people were killed.
So what I'm saying is that this, speaking of the media, speaking of whether actually maybe you're not interested.
No, I'm coming to
it was whether it was
No, it's a very important point, because in Muzaffarnagar, all of us who looked at Muzaffarnagar, and Nakul's work also shows it, the film. I'm sure you've seen Nakul Sawhney's film. Yeah, that the use of the WhatsApp and the use of this technology. So that's one thing I was coming to, that unfortunately today, and you must also read that book, I Am a Troll. I don't know if you've read it, Swati Deshpande's book. It's an important book because it'll be half an hour read for all of you. It's not difficult to read, but it just tells you how the troll is being made to function by the RSS, and how they're recruiting and the kind of money they're spending around it. I think that when I say give these 2-3 hours extra, I'm not saying it just like that. I'm saying that a generation, we are now past 50, okay? But the younger generation is much easier with technology, much more creative in their ideas. We need to be able to have messaging of a kind and which is systematic, which is proactive, which is creative. It doesn't just put things right about Nehru, but put things right about the Indian nation, I mean, I was having this long conversation about over the weekend with a senior union leader. He said, I was brought up in a family that was not communist, which was against the Congress. But we might have opposed this or that policy of Nehru, but You could not deny that he was a modernist with a vision for the nation, you know. So you have to be able to look at critique and criticism in that way, and I think we need to devote our times for some sort of this mass messaging. I'm telling this to young people all the time that this mass messaging, counter mass messaging is very important. Just posters, just booklets are not enough.
और इसमें भी हिंदी का ज़्यादा अगर यूज़
बहुत ज़्यादा यूज़ होना चाहिए, बहुत ज़्यादा यूज़, क्योंकि हिंदी में ही आते हैं. I've got about 30 in my WhatsApp on what Adityanath's calls have been sending in the last 2 weeks from UP, and they are terrible, including what they write about Muslim women and what Muslim women should do now to Muslim men. No, it's a very devious level at which they work. It's not a healthy way in which they work, and it is not just hate driven, it is also destructive. So it is, and of course violent. So as a combination of what, so therefore in Communalism Combat, what we tried to do was to deconstruct the politics of division. And I want to say this because, you know, you're all very sensitive people. And I said this to Tabeen Singh when she wrote a silly article about us, and I wrote a reply. This is about 10 years ago. Communalism Combat, when we were formed, we said as our vision statement that we believe that the riot in the mind festers for years before it spills into the streets. We believe that majority and minority communalism are two sides of the same coin. And we believe with the strength of our conviction that we have taken on minority communalism also. And I just want to give a few examples to you, not because you don't believe me, but I want to say this, is that in 1998, when I published my first cover story, Welcome to Hindu Rashtra, about Gujarat, it was August 98, when there was targeting of these villagers in Randipur and Sanjeli, and boards had come up all over the state. In November that year, because we've always tracked South Asia, we also believe that because of partition and the history of a very bitter partition, it's important to talk about minority rights in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, and not just talk about minorities here. Because if we really want to build a credible South Asia and a peaceful South Asia, we need to talk about minorities. We have to talk about Kashmiri Pandits as much as we have to talk about the horrendous pellets and the way the Indian state has behaved in Kashmir, not just this year but even before. So the point is, we did this cover story on RAWA. Now if you Google RAWA, you may or may not find it today. It's a wonderful organization, Revolutionary Association of Afghan Women. We did a cover story of them because the Taliban was just growing. And I interviewed them through landline, trunk call, international trunk call, 5 trunk calls, half an hour each. We did detailed interviews. And they were basically saying that the Taliban is destroying the Afghani society for women. We women are being forced into prostitution. And the cover story was called Hell on Earth. Many people said, you know, Taliban is nothing, Taliban is not so dangerous. So when it comes to rigidity, exclusion, violence, it can happen in any section of the population, majority or minority. And if we are talking about coexistence, secularism, democracy, egalitarianism, we have to be able to condemn it wherever it comes from. That will give more strength and integrity to our battle, I believe. It's very, very crucial. Taslima Nasreen, I don't believe she's the greatest writer on earth, but when she was threatened by one puny organization in Bombay called Raza Academy, that we burn her alive, it was Nikhil Wagle and us, that is Mahanagar and Communalism Combat, that invited her to Bombay, simply to say that we don't support what you write, but we support your right to say it without being threatened violence. So Communalism Combat therefore tried to work beyond being just a magazine and to become a movement for rationality, for dialogue, and to look beyond the headline, you know, as to what is it that leads to violence. And we also try to focus always on the peacemaker, because we believe in every mohalla, in every street, there are people who actually are building peace every day, as much as there are people who are destroying it. And because of this dictum in the media that bad news is news and good news is no news, you don't really focus on the good news, you know. And I think it's important to keep telling those stories as well, however difficult and far between they are. So we've done stories like good news from Gujarat, 1 year after the violence, which show that in every village where there was violence, there were also people trying to prevent it, you know. Well, I'm facing 9 criminal cases. I've had to take bail 9 times. And I mean, as things get worse, there can be any effort to stop you. Wire faced a problem for a story it carried. Scroll could face a problem tomorrow. So we are a particular enemy of this government. because of the stands we've taken, and it's a particularly small-minded and vindictive government. But we believe that there are ways and manners in which one should resist and carry on. And the strongest resistance is that they've not managed to silence us still. You know.
Thank you for speaking with us. Also, I just wanted to ask you if you can tell us a little bit about the.
Sorry.
So, about the institutional mechanisms which allow a riot to fester in the mind before it's carried out, and particularly in the context of Gujarat. So, instances which occurred prior to 2002 institutionally allowed, which, you know, obviously created that sort of an atmosphere of animosity, particularly maybe in education, media houses, criminal cases, you know. So, I've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence of that, but never really.
Well, I deal with that particularly in my book at length, because what I've been trying to say is that it's not 2002 that is Gujarat. It is the build-up that made 2002 possible. And unless we understand that, we won't understand what allows a Gujarat to happen. You know, and maybe that's what we are all undergoing all over India now. That because the preparation is so systematic. So, for instance, you had in 2002 itself, 6 months prior to that, you had at least maybe 400,000, like 4 or 5 lakh pamphlets being distributed, and I would get these from every district of the state because I was traveling everywhere. Really hateful pamphlets which were trying to kind of really create a demonized image of the Muslim, and also actually exhorting men to rape Muslim women. You know, it was horrendous pamphlet. And in fact, part of Rahul Sharma and Sheikh Kumar's work when they were in the police force was to recommend that one or two of these were VHP pamphlets. Many of these were anonymous, but one or two of them were VHP. The VHP ones did not talk about rape, but the VHP ones talked about socially boycotting Muslim businesses. And these were easily available, which is anti-constitutional. And so the use of hate speech and pamphlets and the authorities refusing to act. It's not institutional, but the institutional not acting when you have evidence of this. I came across in 99 or 2000 one document, anonymous document, which is saying Hindus beware, and it was a fairly detailed document, which was actually teaching the mob, as I call it, how to subvert the police, how to register false FIRs, how to create false evidence, and I actually published this in Combat. It's online, you can see it. And at that time, a police officer who's one of my sources and is also a close friend now, he asked for it to be translated by somebody in Gujarati, and he distributed it to every police station in Gujarat to say, please beware of these tactics, this is the kind of material that is being distributed. In 98 itself, you had the creation in the police force of a cell which started monitoring inter-community marriages, very much like this Romeo thing you're seeing in UP today. And I remember talking to the Director General of Police as a journalist. I interviewed him and I said, you know, this is anti-constitutional. How can you have a cell? My constitution gives me the right to cohabit with whosoever I want once I'm a major. How can you have this cell? And there was no answer to that.
The cell was in the police.
Yeah, it was created by the Gujarat police, a cell to monitor inter-community, inter-caste marriages. I published a circular in Combat. Then you had selective censuses being carried out. A census only for Muslims, a census only for Christians. And you know, they're talking only about Muslims just now, but between 98 and 2000 there were a lot of attack on Christians all over. And 2/3 of this were in Gujarat. So you had the system allowing and creating mechanisms by which a section of your own people could be easily targeted. I say in my book, and I've documented that in 2000, between 2000 and 2001, 2 months, I went and met Justice Farooq. I took all these circulars to him. And I said, sir, there's a terrible build-up happening. Please do a kind of a inquiry and a visit to Gujarat. He said, please keep documenting it, just now nothing can be done. I took the same documents, another set to Fali Nariman in the Supreme Court. I still remember where I met him. It was in the basement Supreme Court library. And I said, sir, this really requires some judicial intervention. He looked at everything. He said, Tisa Khan, nothing can be done, just keep monitoring it.
First one was Justice Varma.
The same NHRC, The same NHRC that he came and did the report afterward. So no, my point is, it's not about the individual. My point is our tendency is to react only once the tragedy happens. But when somebody is pointing out a build-up, which is potentially quite dangerous, somehow they feel that there's nothing that can be done.
Yes.
And I think that is something which was very, very upsetting.
There are some more questions.
Yeah.
One is from Aishik and then one is and one more from there. Just before that, I just want to say one thing that you have avoided mentioning the vernacular press. So in UP where I come from, most riots begin in the vernacular. Dainik Jagran and Dainik Bhaskar specifically mentioned Hindu women being kidnapped. Almost, I can tell you at least half a dozen riots where Hindu women have been kidnapped. It's a false news, you find out no women have been kidnapped. And I think in Gujarat also this kind of rumors was
I have not avoided mentioning, so if you give me 4 hours, I'd have mentioned everything. But in 45 minutes, I can't mention everything. Yeah, if you look at this thing, Sandesh and Gujarat Samachar and look at the editor, this is something which is also very much part of the Zatya Jati petition, that the hate speech, which was allowed not just by VHP pamphlets and anonymous pamphlets, but also by sections of the Gujarati media. And by the way, a very interesting part about it, that the Editors Guild report at the time, not the Editors Guild you see today, which is a very, very supine Editors Guild, though I say it myself, I'm a member. You had Akar Patel, Dilip Padgaonkar and B.G. Varghese bringing out that report. You all must read that report. They actually met Modi, they met the Sandesh editor on all these false reports that Mohsin Sahib is talking about. And incidentally, the Chief Minister at the time wrote a congratulatory letter to all the newspapers that were guilty of inflammatory speech, saying you did a very good job. And the 3 newspapers that did not, this is documented by Editors Guild, I am not saying it. The 3 newspapers, Kutch Mitra, Gujarat Today and Jansatta, who were relatively better in the vernacular and who actually kept cautioning against this kind of, did not receive the congratulatory letter from the Chief Minister. There's also this infamous interview that the Chief Minister gave to none less than Sudhir Chaudhary of the infamous Zee TV, who is now infamous for other reasons. The same Sudhir Chaudhary, who was infamous for JNU reasons. He had interviewed Modi then, and the whole thing was Kriya and Pratikriya. When he was asked this question about Gulbarg Society and Ehsan Jafri, he said, for every reaction, action there is a fit reaction. When the SIT asked for a copy of that tape, Sudhir Chaudhary said he can't remember Modi ever having said that, and Zee TV doesn't have a copy of the tape. So there are many, many aspects to this, the hate speech, the violence, but in terms of institutional memory, there were these censuses, there was this cell being set up by the police. Then you had one very important thing. You had a Babu Bajrangi squad, which was running and allowed to run, unchecked. That whenever a Patel girl married outside the Patel caste to either a non-Patel or a Muslim or a Christian, he would hound her, the squad would hound her and kidnap her and bring her back, and usually succeeded in forcing her to go back on the relationship. And this was just allowed. The Gujarat High Court is full of petitions by one or the other side challenging this. 3 such boys from Bombay, Maharashtra, we had helped them file a case like this in 2007, 2008. They just could not get the judicial remedy.
You've spoken about this before, that one of the key institutional locations that generally tend to not get looked at very closely is the family, where the seeds of hatred and prejudice are actually sown. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the coach program that aimed at taking a different kind of pedagogical approach to the teaching of history into schools.
See, when 92, thank you for asking that, because that's one of the things that gives back a lot of sustenance to our work. Because a lot of the other work we do is very fractious and very tension generating, whereas the work we do with children and schools actually gives us a lot of very positive energy back. So in 92, 93, like I said, the journey began then. One of the things I found as a journalist when I was covering the violence for Business India, is that the classroom had become a place for very, very bitter contestation. The teacher was saying things she shouldn't be saying or he shouldn't be saying. Children were behaving with each other like they shouldn't be behaving. Because after all, when there's a whole chasm it opens up in society itself. And like I say, that my first incident of covering violence was 1984, the Bhiwandi Bombay violence, and that time I saw an east-west divide. I mean, I don't know how many of you know Bombay, but there's a railway track that virtually goes north to south, south to north, and the western part of the city in '84 remained untouched, virtually by what was happening, and all of us who were covering it would find a complete callousness on the west because it was more middle class, upper class, rich. The eastern side was battered, but the western side couldn't really be bothered. 92-93 breached all that. I mean, breached all that completely. I mean, there was no part of Mumbai now, that in Bombay then, that did not see this very, very bitter schism. And in fact, terrible drawing room conversations, very, very brutal things coming out. And it was almost like a respectability being given to hatred and violence in conversation, So this was manifest in our schools as well, it was very manifest. So then I felt the need, very strong need, that one should not only work journalistically, one should not only work in the courts, but one should try and see that something wrong with our textbooks, our pedagogy, even our approach in the classroom, which is not allowing young minds to deal with this kind of prejudicial atmosphere, this conflict, all the things that they're hearing, all the things that they're being talked about, but there's nothing in the school space or the education space that allows you to process it. So I was very lucky at that time. 3 schools gave me the chance to actually work with their faculty and the parents. They were parent-run schools, and they said you work for a couple of years and prepare modules, see if something can emerge in terms of a conflict resolution, peace education effort. So that's how Khoj was born, and we have a separate website. It's called khojedu.net, where we describe our methodology and the process. And the idea is to work with young minds and also work with the teaching community, because the teaching community is the carrier of much of this prejudice, as is the textbook, to actually question social studies, history, the society around you, current events, many of these things. So we've tried to develop a module which is very child-centric, young person-centric, which tries and explores your emotion, the child's emotion in terms of how he or she is receiving some of these images and messages, and try and encourage through some very, very creative modules within the class, how do you deal with it? So, I can give you a few examples, but one of our most fascinating modules is when we deal with migratory history. We ask young people to actually try and trace their own histories, when they came to Delhi, Mumbai, wherever. And so you're training the young person to go back to his or her family, ask questions to relatives. Where did you come from? What language did you speak? Which part of Mumbai or Delhi did you first live when you came in? And you keep bringing those stories back to the class and exchanging them. So the class suddenly becomes more multicolored and multi-hued. And you suddenly realize that there is something to language, there's something to rural and urban. And there's so many things which you just sort of uniformalize in the classroom. So then we have an ideal religion module, you have letter to God. I mean, there are various things we try to do, which is trying to explore the whole gamut of prejudice, not just communal, but even gender, even class, even caste, language. We find it hugely rewarding. We have a team working on this, and it's a 3-year thing. We take children to 3 years to middle school, 5th, 6th and 7th. And we find that if we are able to do it consistently for 3 years, an hour and a half a week, then the kids do start asking questions, because our main intention is not to teach them any brand of anything, least of all secularism. But we believe we should just give them the ability to question what is being fed. And I feel if they have the ability to question that and to keep raising questions with your teachers, keep raising questions, then I think that's a very empowering tool. Including the media, we do a lot of media education with the kids, showing them how events are covered in the media, how tragedies are covered, how television looks at events, how newspapers look at events, so that they don't become victim of the media and they can at least little distance themselves and question it.
There's one behind. The two behind. Can you let them quickly? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Whoever wants to go.
So, going back to the mass messaging like system that we have to go with. So, if the Muslim community really has been demonized through like these various sort of methods, do you think just providing the facts to an average Hindu would like reverse this process? And if not, how do we bring the Muslim community back to a humanized form of visibility? And like how do we reverse this process where this sort of like a demonization has been indoctrinated so deep into the average Hindu? Because not all these average Hindus are necessarily Islamophobic. It's that they have been indoctrinated into becoming that. So how do we reverse this process through this mass messaging system?
See, I think, sorry.
You're talking about the media, how to handle the media like print media like Times of India, which the false news of Najib. How to handle these kind of things and role of online media, print online media.
Yeah, can I answer?
I just want to add on to what he said. Just to follow up. Actually, this is the question which I've been pondering on for a long time now. That I guess we all consider a common man to be a fool who gets swayed by these WhatsApp messaging or other kind of propaganda. I believe that is not the case. They can distinguish. However, the language that we are using probably is not something which they can understand. So do we need to change the language by which we start reaching the common man? I mean, I don't know. So probably a comment on that.
I don't know who's a common man and who's not, but I would be saying that coming back to the question, no, I'm not trying to ridicule, I'm just trying to answer in a certain way. I think that, see, facts should never be compromised. Okay, facts should never be compromised because facts are your strongest defense. However, when you're dealing with very heightened situations, emotions are also important, as we all know, in communication, in advertising, in any mass media. It's that just fact on its own need not do the story. You would also have to have a bit of emotion in it. I feel we should not. We should look at ourselves at multiple levels. There are some people who are doing very good at visual imaging. There are some people who are very good at just straight fact, which itself can be very powerful and by itself can suggest an independence and an autonomy. If you're not emotional, it suggests that you're more factual. You know. So I think we should, without worrying about which is the best way, tell ourselves that multiple ways is possibly the best and most effective way, because that is what the other side is any case doing. That is what human nature responds to. On a good day, I might respond to fact. On a bad day, I might respond to emotion, you know, or the other way around. So I think what we should accept is that there's not only one way of doing it. We should never, but we should never compromise on fact. Not compromising on fact should be a bottom line. But the fact that you need to have good visuals, emotional stories, the story sometimes telling the fact better than just this thing. And I think there are some obvious things which are being, you know, like Muslims and population, Muslims and partition, Christians and conversion, Christians. I think these are things which need to be tackled again and again and again, as often as you can do it, and however create. And there is a lot of material. The material is there. It's a question of how we use it. I also believe that it's our duty to strengthen those hands in the Muslim community who are also battling their own demons within. So for instance, whether it's the dissent battle or the gender battle, we should not shy away from doing that, because I said you do that, you make yourself stronger. It makes our battles stronger. You know that we need to have rational battles all around. So I would only say that we need to have multiple levels of working. Today in journalism, I find that what is missing for me most in mass media is the lack of reportage. There's too much comment. I want reports. You know, I'm essentially a person who wants the information. I know how to process it. Why is that information being denied to me? So I think if we can even facilitate better and more consistent and more extensive reportage, then I think, coming back to what you're saying, if people have enough information, then they will also not necessarily need to be told how to do it. Today the problem with the media is it's giving you only opinion. It's only giving you that kind of very fractious news up, but it's not giving you reportage. It's not telling me, for instance, that 20 different organizations have challenged the chicken and meat and beef ban in UP. It's an empowering citizen action, yeah? Why should I know about it? Why is the media denying me this information? You know, or multiple such examples, you know. What was your question?
On Times of India.
Yeah, see, that is a very crucial issue today. I mean, 20 years ago, when we used to have, we first formed something called the Women and Media Committee. You know, we formed the Women and Media Committee to look at how women are represented in the media and the condition of working women journalists. If we found anything which was, we found problematic in the media, whether it was English or Hindi, we could not monitor all languages, we would take it up with the editors as journalists. You know, we take it up, we take demonstrations, we take delegations. Today, I mean, the day that Najib thing, and it was exposed by some social media networks, you know, the way Rachik around, the police actually denied it. The police said we've never read a story like that. Now that's going one step further than what used to happen, that the police misleading you. Now you're even actually going for, and the report was very detailed. The report said all sorts of things about allegedly what Najib had done. I believe some journalists, some concerned citizens should have gone to the Times of India editor in person. It did not happen. Citizenry and civil society has stopped doing that. We've started believing that just doing online activism is enough. Please, online activism is not enough. It's simply an extension of what you are doing on the ground. It should be an extra arm to what you're doing on the ground. If you think 2 hours on Facebook and 3 hours on Twitter is your activism, please cut that down and do 2 hours on the ground. Because I think that's another big misnomer we have, that we believe that this, how many likes, thousands, how many told you that, I said, what is 1,000 likes? It's nothing. I mean, I get 27,000, see, even that I'm unsatisfied by, because I believe Facebook people don't even go beyond the first 4 lines. So what's the purpose? I want people to read, process and actually act on those articles. No? So I think, you know, somewhere we need to, I think my only answer to you is this, that we have stopped actually shaming and protesting. It's not enough to just say it on this website or that website, on this Twitter, on that this is what Times of India got wrong. DOJ issued a press statement, the Delhi Union of Journalists issued a press statement. More than a press statement, I believe a delegation should have gone to the Times of India editor to say you have to apologize for this. Maybe it should have been followed up by a press conference. But you know, we just let it go. We should not let it go. Press council complaint. These are some of the mechanisms available to us.
So I have a follow-up question. This comment of the today's social activist being the Facebook sharer really reminds me of Camus' sort of Sartre being the armchair revolutionary. But we don't just have this concept of sitting in your armchair and perhaps sharing a Facebook post, but you also have this language divide and media divide as well. So the concept, or my concern here is, if there's a certain group of the population who are reading English language media that may be critical or maybe asking questions, but we have other people unquestioningly receiving WhatsApp messages that are not available publicly. I can't read them. I don't have the phone that is receiving these messages. Then at the same time we have these hate speech laws and we have duty to prosecute, but those prosecutions are not happening and have been happening for decades. These newspapers, there's an author and there's a newspaper and there's an editor to go to, but with WhatsApp, where do we go? How many stages back can we trace the message where it's coming from? And you were mentioning earlier that you've seen some of the messages. So I was wondering, could you perhaps, for the benefit of those who haven't seen the content, talk a little bit about them and then talk about how this Women in Media Committee you mentioned earlier could perhaps be reimagined as a way to kind of provide alternative voice to them.
Yeah, sure.
Let me say about so far in the question that you're making. You've spoken at length about tackling one institutional source of misinformation, that being the media. And this is in relation in bit to Professor Ashik's question. You saw in Gujarat that you have people ready to speak and at the same time you have a lot of people ready to listen. And you say that these riots are a product of years of this festering. So when you talk about the organization code, dealing with like family and the younger kids, what sort of interest or how do you take the government to task in terms of altering curriculum, in terms of trying to change what history is being read. Now, in this sensitive space, we know that this is very apparent when state syllabus is changed or community syllabus is changed. But how exactly do you think the government will task, which being the other institutional source of this?
I'll just take your question first. I just want to say about the social media today. I don't believe that only the English-speaking public is rational, by the way. No, I'm just saying that in one sense, the social media space has also been a very democratizing space. In this day and age when you have a lot of non-reportage in the media, stifling of news in the media, I feel a lot of movements have been gaining strength by putting out their activities and events and everything. I'm talking about even unions, I'm talking about strikes, I'm talking about processions of the landless laborers, the Adivasis. They're using, and if you look at the writers in the Hindi language, because I unfortunately can read Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, I can't read the other, I can't read Odisha, Bengali, and I'm sure the same Malayalam is very active. I think the problem is you have very good writing coming out on Facebook, in the Hindi language and many languages, because persons who don't really have access in many of the structures for a variety of reasons are actually using this as a way to express their thoughts. About WhatsApp, I feel it's not so much about, if you get a series of WhatsApps in UP or Muzaffarnagar about a certain conflict which is attempted to be built up, it is also about building up a campaign to track it back, and to find out who is doing it, or at least try and get the authorities to track it back. But for me, it's both about tracking it back as evidence and finding out who is doing it, as much as trying to create counter material. That for me, why is it that technology is today being overwhelmed by the negative? That all of you would remember the India of 2014, where overwhelming the social media space was dominated by one section. Today you find at least a good fight back, and there is another section also emerging which is trying to kind of put out the other story to combat that. But we also know that side is heavily paid and there's a lot of money going into it. For me, the important thing is also how do we conceive of the social media space as reliable. I mean, that I feel should be non-compromising, because I see myself as a responsible writer and journalist, and therefore I feel too quick a response is also not a good idea. Too quick a response, too unthought of a response sometimes coming out in a language which is worse than what is being put out by the other side. Abusive language. I think those sort of things we should be very, very conscious about and careful about. But I think how do we use this technology for a counter-creative campaign? Which is looking at rights, which is looking at attack on rights, which is looking at even poems, even radical poems, even theatre, even small. What I saw on those WhatsApp, what you were asking me, is the WhatsApp that I've seen are very dangerous because they can be very convincing. They are in the old Akashvani style of the news. I don't know how many of you used to listen to the news on Akashvani radio. And it's a young woman's voice, very breathless, very urgent, very pained, who's trying to tell you what's going to happen to the Hindu population in 20 years. And this is repeated in different forms 6 times. Then you'll be told about what Muslims do with the cow in all these countries. So it's extremely dangerous content, and it's a content that is, we will not get moved by it, but you can see the potential danger of that kind of constant relay. Now today we are living in a situation where the mass consciousness, the political consciousness is not even recognizing that this is a problem. So how do we create a consciousness that this is a problem in the first place? That we are not talking about it just here, but we talk about it publicly, we talk about it to state, to non-state actors, to government, to the courts, that this is a phenomenon which is very dangerous. It's not even being raised by it. We all know it, we all discuss it, but it's not being raised. So I think there are multiple levels in which we need to, and for that we need to document. For that we need to document and collect it and analyze it. Analyze some of this to say that this is the kind of impact it will have. So we are not talking about ban, we are not talking about close this account, but we are talking about how is this being used to actually subvert democracy, subvert the constitution. Can we build a campaign around that? That is a real challenge.
This question on the states, in the history syllabus.
of the work we did in Coach, particularly from 99 onwards, was to analyze textbooks. We did the analysis of about 18 state textbooks, Gujarat included. And we found much of this othering was happening through the social studies and history textbooks. So in fact, in 99 when we published our study on the Coach textbook in Communalism Combat, the Parliament appointed a committee on the basis of our report. And the committee found that some of the passages we had pointed out in our textbook were problematic and asked the Gujarat state to delete those passages. That never happened. So we had to pursue it and pursue it. Then you had 2004, when you had a change in government at the centre. And some of us were appointed to CABE, which is the Central Advisory Board of Education. When that happened, we tried to bring much of these studies to the attention of CABE. And then a regulatory mechanisms committee was appointed, of which we were part, where we did a nationwide study. I can send you a copy of that. It's a very important report that we brought out through CABE. Recommendations were made to government, but they were not followed up by UPA2 either. So the efforts have been constantly made, even with the curriculum, textbook, NCERT, state levels, to try and correct some of these. To some extent, we have succeeded, little bits here and there. Like one example being that Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan used to be there in Maharashtra textbooks, then he suddenly disappeared. Now we've managed to reinstate some of these figures back in the textbook, as the story of partition and pre-partition is told. So it's basically none of these struggles can succeed completely unless you have political articulation of it. And our political class on rights issues, whether it is communalism or history or anything, uses some of these as slogans, but is not completely does not pursue them to their logical end. So therefore, our task also is in the future to convert some of these demands into the political class. You have to be able to convince political parties that this is the right thing to do. So you appoint an NCERT, UPA did that, they got an NCERT textbook change, now they are being reversed again. So to that extent we were successful. But to the extent that many of the state governments have the same textbooks that are continuing. Now you have Asim Anand as one of the heroes in the Rajasthan textbook, a man who's been accused of rape. You have Dinanath Batra textbooks. I don't know if you're aware of them, Dinanath Batra's Gujarat first. Gujarat started them in 2014 and 2015 Haryana has adapted. They are the ones that tell you what the Prime Minister said about the plastic surgery and all that in the dark, that we pioneered pretty much everything. And including the Kunti story was a story of microbiology and all that. So the point is that we have to also make a rational argument about this. That can you really expect children and young people to study this history and then become individuals of excellence and rationality? But we are going in a completely irrational direction.
It seems like you're trying to create a populace that is conducive to a certain kind of message.
That's right.
So, in terms of that message, that's where my question was actually. Like, if you want to counteract the message that is in different kind of platforms, WhatsApp, primary education, secondary education, and just in terms of speeches and stuff. So I just wanted to know what the organization.
No, one is trying many of this, but the point is it has to be done manifold. It cannot be done by only one organization. What this country today needs is political re-education at all levels, I mean, we are negating the very basis of the national movement today. We are negating the very basis on which this nation was formed. So, you actually need a mass level. So one of the reasons when I was responding to this question, but are you going to build this joint front, is the question that as a journalist and an editor, I'm carrying the stories of the Maruti workers, I'm carrying the journalists of the All India forest workers. But I'm also asking them that when you organize the workers, are you talking about communalism? And they are saying to us, then we better start doing it, because unless that starts happening, it will only be economic demand, and we are back to square one. For 30 years we've been saying this. So the point is, part of the reason for building some of these alliances is to see those sectors can then start looking at social justice issues, looking at conflict issues, looking at communalism, and they can actually be political education there. Not simply talking about how to start. And their struggle has been amazing, I'm not trying to undermine it. But it also has to be backed by this political re-education.
Connotations of those struggles.
Yeah, because it's like, I remember having this union meeting on soon after 6 December 1992. I was General Secretary of BUJ, and we called a meeting of all unions in Bombay to say that Bombay is a working class city. So let's have a working class people's procession to protest what happened on December 6th. We have to do it. And the meeting went on for 2 hours, 3 hours long, and all the major union leaders, including Datta Samanthi, was alive at that time, going round and round, not committing. And I was just trying to wonder what it is that this thing. And finally he said, you don't understand. My workers are Kamgar Agadi in the day and Shiv Sena in the night. That's our real challenge.
The union itself is an RSS Shiv Sena union. Most of the trade
No,
unions.
that's different. That's different. Please understand what I'm saying. I'm saying the mass organizations who can organize in numbers are not dealing with tricky issues of communalism. I'm making a different one. And RSS union will do the RSS's job. They're doing everything. That's why we are where we are today. But I'm saying with the progressive left unions, why are we not looking at the issue of political education? That's the question. And that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, perhaps on the optimistic note of a huge challenge, I'd like to thank Tisa Sandoval for coming today for a thoroughly enjoyable